Welcome to Tairyu Shakuhachi, your one-stop shop for all things shakuhachi. I am your host, Sean Tairyu Head, your licensed shakuhachi teacher. Today we have a special guest, not to be confused with the Charlie Parker, the legendary saxophonist. This is a different kind of master. With over 25 years of experience in both shakuhachi and the martial art of Aikido, Dr. Charles Parker has spent a life of exploring spirituality, social justice, and the deep connection between Christianity and Buddhist contemplative practices, both in the US and Japan. He is also an author and will be diving into his latest book, Song of the Samurai. Dr. Parker is a theologian and has had a long career in social justice work. His passions involve aspects of philosophy, martial arts, and music. He lives in Washington, D.C. with his two creative kids and two rescued pets, a grumpy dog named Chewbacca and a neurotic cat named Luna. That sounds like quite the household. Now, on to today's topic. His book, Song of the Samurai, set in Japan in 1745. It's a land under the strict rule of Tokugawa shogun. And amid rumors of a rebellion, we follow the life and times of Kinko Kurosawa, a samurai monk and a master shakuhachi player, on his journey across Japan after being disgraced and expelled from his Zen temple. It's a gripping adventure filled with spies, assassins, ronin, and spirits, all inspired by the real life of Kinko Kurosawa, the founder of the Kinko-ryu School of Shakuhachi. Let's unpack it together. So, Charlie, thank you so much for coming on today and talking about your book.
Thank you so much, Sean. It's great to be here.
So, I'm going to ask the obvious question. What's the inspiration behind the book?
Well, as you noted, I've been playing shakuhachi for about 25 years, and I play in the Kinko school. So I've known a little bit of Kinko's history and the wonderful music that he collected for many years. And initially, actually, I thought that an itinerant monk would be good fodder for a mystery series. Maybe he
Mm-hmm.
had a different murder when he went to a different temple every time, and so I started writing with that in mind, and then it morphed pretty quickly into a much more serious story about a spiritual journey, and that's kind of what brought the book about.
Wonderful. Yeah, he is a very interesting historical character. And it's, someone we have the writings of and read the writings of his offspring and his also other of his students who also mention him. So it's an interesting, historical look too.
Hmm.
And one of the things I noticed about your book and I appreciated was that many times we have, when we read a samurai story, it's really ensconced in this overly romanticized version of the samurai. And I'm not getting that at all. So, what made you decide to go with this more historical approach to Japanese history?
Honestly, Sean, I think history is just more interesting than the sort of sanitized and romanticized stories that we often get. So I thought it was it allows for a more nuanced reflection on Kinko's life, and frankly, one that hopefully is makes him and the story more relatable to people. Something that we can learn from and incorporate into our own lives.
Yeah, and you don't have to have a good memory to when you tell the truth. Uh,
Exactly.
so you aren't just coming from this as an author. You're not just coming as this person who loves history. You're also coming in as a shakuhachi player. Can you tell us a little bit of how you came to the shakuhachi and why you've kept with it for so many years?
Yeah, honestly, I started Aikido first and was doing some reading on Budo and Budo history, and ran across some references to the shakuhachi that I just found very intriguing. And so, of course, did a little bit of investigation and heard some shakuhachi music that I thought was very haunting and really struck me. And then I loved the tie-in between the musical instrument and Zen practice. And honestly, I loved the fact that the Komuso also used this thing as a weapon. And so I thought all of it was just very intriguing. I initially bought a book that I tried to teach myself, and then
Mhm.
fairly quickly found Ronnie Selden, who became my teacher for many years and led me on my first trip to Japan. And it has been a really very powerful gift over the years in terms of just exploring music, but also exploring meditation and contemplative prayer from a Christian standpoint.
In your book, you mentioned this when, in this part, I had to laugh, and I shared it with some of my students too, and they all had a little nice chuckle with it. And they said when Kinko Kurosawa is studying shakuhachi with a man named Ikkei, Ikkei says this, quote, "These three, referring to the historical pieces, are centuries old and date back to the beginnings of our order. They are Kyore, Koku, and Mukaeji. Let's play Koku together to begin. It's the easiest of the three." Now, I laughed with that because for at least in our school, Koku is a very, very difficult piece. And so is Ike trolling Kinko here, or
So, just for reference, Ike, aside from Kinko himself, Ike is actually the only person in the novel that we know existed. All the rest of the characters in the novel are fictitious, but Ike was Kurosawa's teacher in Nagasaki, and we
yeah?
know that. I'm going to say he's trolling Kinko, but I'm going to tell you also the honest truth is I think I meant to write Kyorei and I wrote Koku by accident and I just never noticed it. So
Well,
until you
we'll say that it's just keeping the shakuhachi players on their toes.
exactly.
So more into the book, I wanted to ask about how this book is divided because it's very interesting. It seems to have four sections and it's based on the seasons. Is this an intentional move? And if so, why or why not?
Yeah, it was absolutely intentional. Part of it was sort of a nod to Japanese poetry that, as you
Hmm.
know, is very shaped by references to the seasons. And as I wrote, the sections of the book, the seasonal sections of the book, became sort of metaphors for what was happening in the story. So, you know, the summer section is filled with passion and angst, and the fall section is a little bit more reflective, and the winter section is about privation and paring back, and then the spring section is about new life. So
Mhm.
it became sort of a metaphor for me.
As I read the book, it was clear to me that you really have something strong to say to both shakuhachi lovers and people who know nothing about the shakuhachi. Without spoiling anything, do you think you can give us a little bit of some of that message?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, the shakuhachi community is my niche audience, and I think the people who will enjoy it, um, and you know, we're passionate about our instruments, so we love a story about Kinko. Ultimately, though, the novel is a redemption story. It's a story about new life and the new life that gets offered through a journey of spiritual enlightenment. It's about a man whose life is upended through his own fault, and has to figure out somehow how to put it all together. And you know that's a story that all of us experience at some point in our lives in some way. And so hopefully it's a story that anyone can relate to and benefit from and learn from. In addition to being just a fun adventure story from 18th century Japan, and again for those of us who are shakuhachi players, a wonderful exploration of our instrument.
I agree, absolutely. Well answered, and I hope that people do pick up this book. And by the way, you can buy the book if you go to the description of this video. As you're writing about Kinko Kurosawa, I love that you focus on his life as a traveling scholar, collecting pieces through Japan and visiting all these places. What type of writing prep took place to prepare for such a detailed outline?
Well, again, I've been playing his music for many years, so I've had some sort of baseline of knowledge that I brought into it, as well as the study of Budo over the years. When I started writing it, though, I started doing some fairly intensive research about mid 18th century Japan and just started sort of plowing through historical texts and realized pretty quickly that I could do that for the rest of my life and never get to write the actual book. And so I shifted modes and started writing, and then I would research particularly locations because this is a travel story. It's an
Mhm.
epic. And so as Kinko would move from one city to the other, I dug in and researched that city and what did the architecture look like, and were there foods that they were famous for, and were there historical characters who might have passed through there, and you
Hmm.
know, I did a lot of very specific research on very specific places. Some of them um, pretty small and not sort of on the main track. But hopefully then in that way giving a lot of color to the story.
No, absolutely, and this transitions us perfectly into the next section of this interview, which I wanted to read a couple passages. And the reason why I wanted to highlight the passages of your writing so much is because it flows so easily for a reader. And it's very easy to read, but it's not boring at all. I've had plenty of books where, yes, it's a very easy read, but I'm snoozing by the half of the first page. So I wanted to take an excerpt from Calling Bamboo, which is perfectly what you just said here, because you're mentioning real life places that still exist today. You can go and see these places, and they were used historically, and even the way you're using them is correct, and it's absolutely just fascinating. So here we go from Calling Bamboo. Even at a slow pace, it didn't take long for Kinko to reach the Nagasaki Kaido, which was far wider and better maintained than the city streets. As he neared the dodge of the city, or the edge of the city, he came to the first government post station and checkpoint, Yamagamishuku. These stations occurred every few miles along the country's major roads, which allowed for regular horse changes for the shogun's messengers and served as security checkpoints to monitor travelers. Early after taking power, the Bakufu government had instituted a policy requiring the country's powerful daimyo, who governed the provinces throughout the nation, to establish a permanent residence in Edo, where they would spend 1 year of every two. Their families, however, needed to stay in Edo continually, effectively acting as hostage against any potential rebellion. So here you're taking us into the harsh realities of the Edo Bakufu. Tell us a little bit more about the harsh political reality and why it's important to this book.
Well, as your listeners may know if they watch Shogun, the establishment of the Tokugawa shogunate was the culmination of a lot of years of pretty intense regional violence. In fact, most of the prior century was dominated by a lot of violence from different warlords sort of jockeying for position, and then that finally comes to a culmination at the Battle of Sekigahara in 1600. And after the shogunate was established and then sort of really solidified in 1650, um, the Tokugawa family was not about to let go of the reins and let that violence re-erupt. And so it was on one level, a very repressive system of government with a lot of spies, a lot of monitoring of people's travel, and while that was very harsh on one level and was sort of onerous if you happen to be a samurai or a lord, um, it also had some very significant plus sides to it. If you're a farmer who needs to know that you're going to have an uninterrupted year to grow your crops, and you're not going to have marauding soldiers coming to steal your crops or fields being burnt in the middle of a battle, that's a pretty significant advantage. Or if you're a merchant and you've got to travel the roads safely with merchandise, the Tokugawa shogunate was hard, particularly on the upper levels of society, but it had a lot of benefits for the folks that were lower down on society. And of course, the book explores a lot of those tensions between the different classes in Japanese society of that period.
Yeah, and the roads, though they were fairly well maintained, they were still fairly dangerous to travel, and you definitely didn't want to do it alone.
Per- Correct, and particularly the farther away you got from the cities of Edo and Kyoto. So as Kinko moves from Kyushu Island onto Honshu, and he's traveling that long Sanyodo road from the end of Honshu um, to Kyoto. It's can be a little bit dangerous, and he finds himself at one point, in fact, having to join up with a group of merchants just to stay safe.
One really common thing that I learned about living here in Nara is that in the Edo era, a lot of the bandits went into the kofuns and all of the old grave sites and stole all the fine goods and merchandise, left the
Mm,
bodies behind, but took swords and valuables, gold and silver
right.
and stuff. All right, another passage here from Dancing by Lantern Light. Awaiting the night's festivities, Kinko gazed out from a third floor window and watched the pleasure quarters transform. When he arrived a couple of hours earlier, it looked much the same as any other urban commercial district. But after the sunset, strings of huge lanterns were hung from ropes across the streets, meticulously painted and elaborately clad. Koshi and Tairyu roamed the streets, followed by the servants of their houses. Vendors sold every kind of delicacy. Itinerant street musicians played for donations. And everywhere, all manner of men prowled and strutted, proud samurai, wealthy merchants, greater and lesser lords, followed by their servants, all on the hunt. Kurosawa watched with a fascinated detachment. It all looked like theater. Soon, however, his services were needed. He turned from the magical night outside to the raucous celebrations within the scent of cherry blossoms. How in the world does a Zen monk end up working as a performer in the pleasure quarters of Hiroshima?
As you know, Sean, from the history, working in the pleasure quarter at that point was did not have the same sort of moral stigma that prostitution does in today's 21st century America.
Hmm.
And because of the way the shogunate had established pleasure quarters in Edo and then all the cities around the country, um, those those became sort of cities within cities with their own very distinct culture. Um, Kinko finds himself in Hiroshima on his way to Kyoto, and he's frankly he's in need of some cash, and you can it's playing in the pleasure quarter was well remunerated. He makes a friend of another musician and spends a little bit of time there, um, playing and earning a little bit of money. In terms of the book's plot, however, what it does is puts Kinko in sort of an unusual position in that he is playing with and spending time with the artisans and the lower class folks from his community, and he's on some level watching his own samurai class from the outside. So it's really a place where he starts to get a little bit more introspection about how samurai impact the rest of the Japanese community, and frankly, particularly in the pleasure quarter, a lot of that picture is not particularly attractive. You know, it's the samurai are often rude and exploitative and belligerent, and he it's harder sometimes to see that when you're in the midst of your own class. But as an artisan playing sort of on the outside of that and looking in, he gains a lot of appreciation for um, how the rest of the country feel about the samurai, um, and so it's really part of his own sort of spiritual revelation in that process.
So I want to remind the listener that they can purchase the book Song of the Samurai in the description box below at the Amazon link. Let's go to another passage here, Misogi. This was more conversation from Tanaka than Kinko had heard in the entirety of his visit, but he couldn't keep from asking, if it is a spiritual battle, why do we practice with the staff so relentlessly every morning? Tanaka looked at him with a mixture of pity and exasperation. How can you not understand? A warrior and a monk spends his life in training for spiritual battle. It is who we are. Our minds must be sharp and awake. Our bodies must be fit and strong. Our spirits must be calm, deep, and steady. Everything we do impacts every other thing. We cannot sit zazen without being powerful. We cannot see clearly without being pure. We cannot fight without being centered. As the great Zen master Dogen taught, to master one Dharma is to master all Dharmas. He stopped again. Kinko thought for a moment and then continued. But Shisho, enough! Speak to me no more. You're wearying me with your foolish questions. You will never understand. You must do. And with that, he picked up his shakuhachi and began to play. Kinko spends a hard winter on this holy mountain of Koya-san, and with an eccentric monk named Fumon Tanaka. What does he learn here, and why is this so important to our story?
So the winter on Koyasan is for Kinko a time of sort of shedding and clarifying. He's forced to confront some of his understandings of himself as a musician and a monk. Um, this Fumon Tanaka character, as you probably recognize, Sean, has got some elements of the monk Watazumi
Ah, yes.
in him, and also some of the characteristics from some of the early desert fathers who were part of Christian tradition. He's very abrupt. He's very austere, and he helps Kinko um, start to understand the ways that Kinko's ego and his need to perform have shaped his himself in some sometimes unhealthy ways. So he really guides Kinko through this process of becoming more self-aware and more aware of the spiritual realities around him, and really helps him to grow and then sort of emerge from that as a different person.
I have one last section here I want to read, and this is from Temple of Music. His words confused Kurosawa. I'm sorry, but I don't understand. What can you be arguing about that has to do with me? Yesterday, two of your fellow Komuso came through the village, begging as usual. The man spat the words out. With Fudaiji so close, we see you're like often. These two also said that they were from Fudaiji. When their collections were insufficient, they bullied and harassed our villagers. They even beat a few of us. And it's death for us if we raise a hand against a samurai, even in self defense. Ending in an eruption of outrage, the man barked, "You claim to be seeking charity when your begging is little better than extortion." So, it sounds odd to many Westerner ears to hear about a mendicant monk bullying, extorting villagers. How did this come about, and why is this important to the story?
Well, the Fuke order, Sean, is was a mendicant order that supported itself by begging. And so, in some respects, there are some echoes of the Franciscan order in Western Catholicism. But unlike the Franciscan monks, the Fuke were all of samurai class, and most of these monks were only in the temples on a temporary basis. The Tokugawa shogunate was very eager to again keep the countryside controlled, and if you had a samurai who lost his lord and was a ronin, he was wandering around the countryside often wreaking some havoc. And so the shogunate really liked to and encouraged um, um, lordless monks or lordless samurai, ronin, to move into the Fuke temples for at least a period where they would continue practicing their martial skills, keep them honed, and wait for a time when they could be hired by another lord. So most of these guys were not in the temple system for religious reasons. They were samurai, and they had to go out begging, which put them in a foul mood to begin with. And so again, it's easy to romanticize these sort of warrior monks, but they were often an unattractive group of characters, and could bully and extort the people they were sort of begging from. And this actual part of the story is a actual historical event where two monks from Fudaiji had beat up some villagers, and interestingly, the villagers ended up sort of bringing a lawsuit, a formal complaint against their village elders for not protecting them against these nasty monks. But but again, it's the reason I put the story in here is to sort of as I mentioned earlier, sort of continue this process of stripping away this more romanticized version of what a komuso might have been,
Mm.
and bring it really to be more faithful to the historical record on that. And there's also a way in which um, Kinko, hearing this again from the standpoint of the villagers, is also stripping away some of his own romanticized version of what it means to be a monk and to be part of this Fuke sect. So again, this is part of his increasing journey of self awareness and an appreciation for um, who he is and what this institution is about.
I love this part of the book too because it reminds me of many of the old Jidaigekis that I fell in love with. These, 1940s, 1950s movies. There's some of them are kind of, now that I watch them, are sort of comical. There's one that's called the lineage of the Komuso, and there's a scene where like 5,000 ghost Komuso appear off the mountainside, all playing their shakuhachi and they're playing kyore
Mm-hmm.
together. But there's a scene in a Musashi film where Musashi is sitting in a sort of an izakaya, grabbing a small drink, and kind of sitting there in that very stoic, what we would call shibui look. And a komuso comes to the front of the shoten guy and just starts playing a shakuhachi right in the window. And like everybody kind of stops and like looks at him, and it's not this look of like, oh, this is cool, or I'm going to contemplate on this. It's more of a kind of like, oh, not this again. And so the one of the people from the back of the store runs out of the shop, puts some money in his bowl, and goes, "No, okay, sorry, get on going, get on going." And then, the he turns around, Musashi turns back around, and then he goes, oh, "Glad that's over," right? And so there has been this long view of it not being something that's welcomed, and even living here in Nara, there's been some old timers who would tell me about their grandparents living in Nara and experiencing komuso. It's like, oh yeah, my grandpa used to. I remember as a kid, and I was like 14 years old. My grandpa used to complain about komuso. It's like they're just. He said, man, they smell bad, and all they play poorly, and they just want some money. It's just you want to get them away as fast as possible. So you throw some
Right.
money in the bowl, and it's just like, okay, get on out of here. It's bad for business.
Yeah. No, I actually I remember the scene you're talking about in the Musashi film, and it also makes me think too a little bit of that wonderful samurai movie Harakiri, which really is again stripping away and some of the mythology around these ideas of samurai honor and seppuku
Mm-hmm.
uh, and really exposing it for sometimes a very uh, coarse, unattractive motivations behind it.
It when I was in school, and I remember like even just in primary school, middle school, high school, that what I wanted so much, I never thought history was that interesting because they always cleaned it up.
Hmm.
And my sort of image of the samurai when I was a teenager was, oh yeah, they ran around in armor and like slashed each other with swords. It's like, no, not at all. They use guns just like everybody else. And even in the time of like in the 1500s and 1600s, there was more guns in Japan than any other part of the world
Hmm.
combined. There was that many guns. And
Hmm.
so there's but that part of the history of them, how they used like the matchlock gun systems and how they used types of pistols and rifles, is absolutely fascinating. And to look at some of the way that they used, how they did battle operations and so on is very interesting. So I really like this, that it's no there's no cleaning up of the history. You're just as welcome in the pleasure quarters as you are in a brute scene of a couple monks beating on some villagers, and it makes for such a gripping story that it goes like, man, it's something thing you can't make this stuff up, and because we didn't, it's the real deal.
Right.
Well, is there anything else that you would like people to know about your book, Song of the Samurai, available on Amazon? Anything else you'd like people to know about it?
Uh, no, I think again, it's a book that that we shakuhachi players will love, and I hope also it's a book that anybody will resonate with who's on a spiritual journey of their own. The audio book has also just come out the last couple weeks, and it's quite wonderful. So it's also an option.
Oh, wonderful. I used to live on audiobooks when I was living in Houston. I had these long, I mean, Houston, you drive from one part of the state to the next part of the state is 15 hours. And so even my drive in Houston, I was driving 2 or 3 hours a day. So I got through books very quickly. So I highly recommend you get this audiobook. It will keep you company on your long tracks to work and back home. Well, thank you so much for joining me today. A huge thank you to Dr. Charles Barker for joining us and sharing his incredible insights on the world of shakuhachi, aikido, feudal Japan, and walking us through his book, Song of the Samurai. If you're intrigued and want to dive deeper into the captivating story, you can pick up a copy on Amazon. Just check the link in the description below. If you love learning all things shakuhachi, consider joining our YouTube membership for access to hundreds of lesson videos for a low monthly price. Thank you for tuning in. Roll for 10, and I'll see you guys in the next video.
Thanks, Sean. Bye bye.